Sure. No, like I said, I don't want to, so that everybody can make that decision, but I don't want to seem like I'm being evasive.
Yeah.
But I don't think people should be taking medical advice from me.
Right. No,
So now that we are live and that people are filing in, I'll just repeat. I'm Jeremy Faust. This is the Doctor's Lounge Inside Medicine. I'm joined by Caitlin Jetelina, Dr. Jetelina, of your local epidemiologist. Good to see you.
Good to see you. And I would say that this isn't a little piece of news. I mean, this is massive. I think I text one of my friends, alarm for red alert. I mean, this is big news in the vaccine policy world.
Yeah, and we're sort of shocked by this, although I think we might have seen this coming in the sense of for a long time since Robert F. Kennedy Jr. became Secretary of Health and Human Services, there's been a lot of talking points about the CDC's vaccine committee. That is the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. That's ACIP. We'll use that terminology, ACIP. And that there's been some lobbing of some shade towards ACIP from HHS leaders, right? I mean, we've really heard this from RFK. We've heard this from his lieutenants, and I think we've been worried that something like something could happen where ACIP, which is duly elected voting members, could actually be vacated summarily. And I'm not sure if it's legal or not. That's a good question. But that is what RFK Jr. has said is happening today, that he announced in the Wall Street Journal his intention to retire all 17 voting members of CDC's ACIP. And this is really on a couple of weeks ahead of their next meeting.
Yeah, 2 weeks ahead of the meeting.
Yeah.
So to back up for everyone, there's a few in the normal process of vaccine policy in the United States. It goes through a set of checks and balances. So first, it goes through FDA to know if it's safe and effective, like a vaccine or a medical device or a drug, and then for vaccines, particular, it goes to CDC to determine who gets that vaccine. So FDA usually determines the what, right? Is it safe? Is it effective? Then CDC determines the who. Who is getting this, at what time, at what intervals, who is eligible. And the reason that's important is a few things. One is that, and I feel like I'm going 2,000 miles per hour, but I'll say that the ACIP, which is the committee that he really overturned he just dropped these 17 members, out of the sky, basically. They are external. They are a panel of people that have day jobs, but are out there, right? Pediatricians, vaccinologists, physicians, epidemiologists. I mean, it's a wide array of people, and they determine and give recommendations to CDC who's supposed to be eligible. This is important for a few reasons. And Jeremy, feel free to jump in too. But one is insurance coverage.
Yes.
Right? Insurance companies look to CDC recommendations to know what to cover and how. The second is this program called Vaccines for Children, which is a government program that gives more than 50% of U.S. children in the United States get their vaccines from the Vaccines for Children program. And that is government paid, so these kids can have free access to vaccines. And so the concern here is multiple fold, but one, how unprecedented this is. No one's ever just dropped all ACIP members at once. Two is how it's being done and what the rationale is behind it. A lot of cherry pick studies that we've heard from anti-vaxxers for a very long time. And then three, of course, the implications to people on the ground, which, right, Jeremy, we still don't really know what's going on. You said, there is a scheduled ACIP meeting happening at the end of this month, June 25th to 27th. Is that still going to happen? Or is he going to find 17 members ahead of time? How is he going to find them? What are they going to be judged on? Is all really big open questions.
All right, I'm going to repeat some of what you said and add some further context to that, because people are filing in, and we're trying to unpack what it means that Secretary Kennedy has just retired all 17 members of the CDC's voting members of their vaccine advisory committee. And as Caitlin just said, this has legal implications. Under the Affordable Care Act, what ACIP votes on, who they say needs a vaccine, that is legally required for adult coverage for private insurers. And so when ACIP says something and the CDC director, which we don't have right now, signs off on that, or the HHS secretary, in the absence of a CDC director, signs off on that, that becomes the United States law of the land for private insurers. Now, the Vaccine for Children program does not require further signage from anyone higher, but he just vacated them too. So the same people who vote on that. So that's number one, is the legal implications of who will have access to this. The second piece is that I really want people to pay attention to this. This is a very visible HHS right now. You have RFK on YouTube and on X, Twitter, and on Fox News, and writing a policy in the Wall Street Journal. He literally announced this policy of getting rid of all 17 voting members in the Wall Street Journal. That is highly visible, but that is not transparent. And transparency and visibility are actually different. Transparency is, as you said, Caitlin, it is the process by which these questions get adjudicated. Is what happens normally is the CDC says, hey, we're going to vote on a vaccine. Let's make a working group. And that working group puts the data together. And then they ask questions, and the public can see that question, and they can actually contribute data and questions and comments. And then the votes are done in public. That's transparency. This is just a draconian move. And his stated reasons is kind of what I think, a kind of a fever dream of conspiracy. This Secretary Kennedy, seems to have a misunderstanding. He thinks that expertise and conflict of interest are the same thing. And ACIP is filled of people who are experts. And that means that they have studied vaccines. And I guess in his view, that makes them part of some conspiracy.
Well, and it's not like, I mean, so a lot of, I obviously read a few articles before we hopped on here, but one of the justifications that he's bringing is conflicts of interest. And the conflict of interest policy and procedure for ACIP is so obvious. I mean, it's so obvious. I mean, it's so transparent. I mean,
It's literally online, by the way. They have
it
to
is
announce everything.
online. You can go online and see it. And yes, maybe someone on ACIP worked with pharma 30 years ago, but that's certainly not the present case. And I think that there's some value in people that work on vaccines. I mean, Offit is a great example of someone who helped create the rotavirus vaccine, and it ended up as a researcher in academia, and then ended up going to industry because industry has the R&D to upscale it. So yeah, I don't. What is going to happen?
I think that another thing about this is for people to understand, again, like sort of like the checks and balances of how this all works, right? These members are duly elected. They're experts. They're not just randos. And they make recommendations. And one of the things I think is really unsettling here is that in his Wall Street Journal opinion piece in which he announces national policy, Secretary Kennedy says, oh, these are just rubber stamped. They're just rubber stamping everything. And in fact, like that often happens. But the reason that it appears that way is that by the time we get to the votes, they've only chosen the things that they really think matter, right? It's sort of like saying like, oh, geez, like who's in the finals? Oh, there's always a winner. Okay, but there's that piece of it. But also there have been examples where the CDC director did not adopt the recommendation of ACIP. And I'll give the most recent example of that happened during COVID. And that is that ACIP, actually the FDA and ACIP, their panelists voted to do boosters for high-risk people, but not for standard risk people. That was what they came up with. That was the committee. This committee that RFK thinks is, a conspiracy. They did not want boosters for all. Rochelle Walensky, who was the director of the CDC, overrode the committee because that was her right to do that as CDC director, and said, we're just doing boosters for all here. Now, I didn't necessarily 100% agree with the science on that. The data were really unclear at that time. But that was an example of a very public process. We know what the data were. The committee made a recommendation that said yes to this group, no to another. And a CDC director overrode part of it and then adopted other parts. That's not what usually happens, but I just want everyone to realize that we actually have a transparent process by which an actual conversation between reasonable minds can occur. And I think that's really what's at stake here.
Yeah, it is at what's stake here. Jeremy, someone just asked in the chat, what does this mean for us? And I'll just be 100% transparent. I don't know.
Right.
We do not know what the implications of this are to our access to vaccines. There's a few ways this could turn out. One is he's already gotten rid of all 17 members. He gets 17 other members. So this is, I guess, best case scenario. He gets 17 really highly qualified members, and life goes on as usual. We still have these meetings every 3 times a year. There we look at data, etc. Recommendations go through. All vaccines are still available to us. Now, that's the best case scenario. Now, there's also a worst case scenario. I don't know if we want to go down this, but it could be worst case scenario. He stacks the ACIP with 17 anti-vaxxers, and not sorry, my phone is just blowing up. And none of the vaccines become available to anyone. They're not recommended, and then thus insurance doesn't cover it. Where we land in that spectrum, I'll be honest, I don't know. I'd be
Yeah.
curious of what your thoughts are, Jeremy.
Well, that's right. We don't know because, again, we could wake up tomorrow to find a reasonable committee. That would be great. Another thing that I want to point out is that what ACIP does is the minimum requirement for coverage. And this is something that I'll just do a little advocacy here. We have a lot of viewers right now. Maybe some of them are from insurance companies. Insurance companies can go beyond what CDC recommends. They can choose to cover a vaccine on their plans that is not recommended by ACIP. And I would just say that in an environment in which we have an ACIP that is not reliable, if we come to that place, I would just call upon the private insurers to do the right thing and to say, let's keep our community safe.
Well, and honestly, Jeremy, so this is where it's really interesting to me is the dynamics between power players. Because insurance companies, it's actually way more expensive for an insurance company to treat a measles case than
Oh, yeah.
actually give out MMR vaccines, right? So if I'm an insurance company, I would actually feel like I'd be incentivized to still cover vaccines, because that means less hospital costs, less going to the emergency department, et cetera. And so I actually think maybe this is where I'm a little more optimistic on these other power players at stake, and not just RFK. And it'll be really interesting to see how they start interacting with each other, and who keeps pulling the ranks around this.
Well,
I would say, I would say, oh, insurance companies care about, the health of Americans. I think there's a bottom line there, right?
yeah.
And that's the reality here. Jeremy, I have to get off in like 4 minutes. Someone is calling me. I'm curious though about your thoughts, Jeremy, about Cassidy. So during, go ahead. I'll just set the stage. So during RFK Jr.'s confirmation hearing back in whenever that was that February? Wasn't it Cassidy that said, do not mess with ACIP? Or that was one of the contingency points of him saying yes to RFK. And now look what RFK did. I mean, at what point does that power play of Congress start stepping in too?
Yeah. So Bill Cassidy is a physician, and he's also the leader of the HELP committee, which would be the committee that would vet the HHS secretary first before it goes to final confirmation. And it was widely seen that as Cassidy would go, the Republicans would go. And so he was the key vote, because you weren't going to have Susan Collins and Murkowski and other people who might stand against someone unreasonable bother to do that if Cassidy was going to be a yes. And he went out and said, you can't touch vaccines, and he made a big deal about it. He got some quote unquote assurances from RFK on things he would and wouldn't do. I'm not sure whether those official assurances, or the ones he said, have been abided by. Like, one of them is that he said, I need a 30-day waiting period. You have to tell the HELP committee 30 days before you make any changes to the vaccine safety monitoring program. But that's not the same thing as ACIP. So I don't know whether or not Cassidy's actual letter of what he was promised has been violated. But in any case, I will say, as a physician, Bill Cassidy has let us down because he was the person who could have stopped this. I think that Bill Cassidy should own this. I think that the Senate cannot recall anybody. It's hard for that to happen, but pressure can be brought upon the public and our leaders. And I would just add this, Caitlin. RFK Jr. was asked by the Help Committee again, whereas Cassidy is the chair. He was asked a month ago, roughly, May 14th, who the acting CDC director is. And under oath, RFK Jr. said it was a guy called Matthew Bazzelli. And
Chief of
that was
staff.
who was not then the acting CDC director and is not now by all accounts in public reporting the CDC director. He said under oath to Senator Lisa Blunt Rochester that Matt Bazzelli is a public health expert. That's false, but whatever, that's his opinion. But who was the acting director of CDC. And that's just not true because the day before that happened, RFK himself signed ACIP recommendations for one vaccine, ignored two others, specifically because there's no CDC director. Bazzelli was not appointed at midnight that day. He's not cosplaying as director. Everyone knows there's no director. And that's because Susan Menarez cannot be the acting director ever since she was nominated for the permanent position. So,
How
yes.
convenient is that? There's no CDC director right now.
And
That's
by the
very
way,
convenient.
they slow walked this. Menarez is finally on the Hill this week answering questions, but that confirmation will not happen until August or September at the earliest, I am told. And that way, who can do this work? By law, ACIP-related activities, signing off on these vaccines, can only be signed off on by the acting or permanent CDC director or the secretary. It cannot be devolved to even the acting chief medical officer of the CDC. Cannot be devolved to Jonas Salk himself, rest his soul. It has to be the HHS secretary. So I think that Cassidy owns this, and it's a shame.
I just checked. He hasn't said anything on Twitter yet, or X, or whatever. So it'll be.
And I'll say that at MedPage Today, where I'm editor-in-chief, we have asked Senator Cassidy for an on-the-record interview on several occasions, and we have been rebuffed. And I think that Senator Cassidy owes us an explanation for this because he was the one who promised us that he's got this. And I don't think that Senator Cassidy feels good about this. I don't think Senator Cassidy is sitting there going, "Oh, this is fine." I think Senator Cassidy is feeling bamboozled.
Yeah. Well, here, someone is watching our live and text saying Cassidy did say ACIP. So this is what he said on the speech of the floor at the nomination, that he, RFK Jr., has also committed he'll work within the current vaccine approval and safety monitoring systems and not establish parallel systems. If confirmed, he'll maintain the CDC Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, ACIP, without changes. CDC will not remove statements on their website pointing out that vaccines do not cause autism, blah, 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 blah. So he did.
Well,
It's right there.
I'm not a lawyer, but I love reading case law. He hasn't changed ACIP. He hasn't changed the process. He hasn't changed the legal standing. He simply vacated the members. There's no
It
word
says
on there.
without changes. This
To what?
17 members.
None of it. He didn't change the committee. He just
The
changed
process.
who's on it. Who's on it. And by the way, I mean,
Blimey. That is blimey.
I think it's shady. I think the American people deserve a very transparent process, and we're not getting that. And look, by the way, I'll say this about a lot of the changes that have happened during this administration. If you think, for example, and I don't, but if you think that there are research endeavors that the NIH is funding, or that there are global health efforts that USAID has funded that are not adequate to that aren't up to what we thought they were, that need reform, then you go and reform them, and you do it in a way that doesn't literally take medications and research dollars out of people's hands so they have to stop the work immediately. You don't light the fire. You don't light the place on fire. You say, "Hey, let's do some reconstruction. Let's call in a contractor." And so when they keep lighting the place on fire instead of doing a retrofit, and I'm not sure the retrofit's needed, but again, just notice how they do this stuff.
I know. It is. It is incredible. Okay, Jeremy, I have to jump off. I'm sorry.
Okay. Before you do, I'm just going to remind everyone to go. We have a shared audience here. It's your local epidemiologist. It's
Yes.
Inside Medicine. Please check out, like and subscribe to these things to share this information. People are confused. I can hop on. I can stay on for a little bit longer, but we will
There's
absolutely
lots of
do
questions.
this. Yeah, and Caitlin, just for your knowledge, I'll touch base with you afterwards in terms of if we want to share this with your readers. Just wait before you do that so we can be on the same page.
I don't know if this is helpful, but this is big news. This is big news, guys, and has potentially really big implications. But all right, I'm jumping off. Bye, Jeremy.
Okay, bye. Everyone else, I'll stick around for just a little bit and get your answer. Try to answer a few of your questions. And I just want to, just sort of clarify for people who are coming in late. Caitlin Gentilina just joined me for 20 minutes, a half hour, to discuss this really shattering news that Secretary Kennedy has announced in the Wall Street Journal his intention to vacate the entire membership of the CDC's Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, the body that by law tells private insurers what vaccines under preventative care they must cover, and that provides for votes for both that and also for the vaccine program for children, which is how about 50% of United States kids get their vaccines paid for. And so when this committee is undermined, then we really are worried about access, and we don't know what'll happen, right? There's an ACIP meeting coming in just a couple of weeks, a few weeks, and we are expecting an agenda today for that. We sort of had an idea of what that would look like. But we were not expecting this. But I will say that it's not a terribly huge surprise in some ways, even though it is shocking. And the reason for that is that just 2 weeks ago, was it last week or the week before? I think it was the week before. Time is very strange lately. Secretary Kennedy announced a sudden change in his view on what ACIP should do vis-a-vis COVID vaccinations, saying that healthy kids and pregnant patients should not necessarily get vaccinated. And then a few days later, the CDC's ACIP actually changed their tables and their recommendations. And it's unclear. They didn't do exactly what he had said, but clearly there was some pressure there. And so we haven't gotten that story told. I'd like to know what happened behind the scenes. I'm not getting it from my sources. And on top of that, talking to legal experts like Dorit Rice, it's very unclear if any of that's legal. And the reason for that is that we have a very specific legal process for how ACIP functions. And you can imagine why that's important. If it's going to be national policy, that there's going to be law that says that a private insurer must cover a vaccination for a specific population based on the committee's recommendations, you really have to have a very ironclad, transparent process that involves public sharing of data, public votes, so it's on the record. And those voting members, we have to know who they are and where they came from, what is their expertise, what conflicts of interest might they have, what is their record. And so for CDC to have changed their recommendations on COVID vaccinations a couple of weeks ago without any of that, without that normal transparency that we expect, then we really have been robbed of something very important in the system. You could actually agree or disagree with the outcome of those changes, those vaccine changes. But you should not agree with summary, immediate changes that go outside of the legal process, or at least the public process that allows us to be informed. When I look at the CDC data on their vaccines, I'm looking at slide decks that they have made public for weeks and months so that I know what it is they're talking about. And I'll be honest, there have been times when I scratched my head and said, that's a little on the margin. I'm not sure. But, but it's transparent, and it's reasonable minds can disagree. But I think that what's being robbed in this previous news cycle, where it was just a change without the process, was highly visible but not transparent. With this change, we are really worried about the next set of recommendations. And the June ACIP meeting later this month, really the agenda would be things like who should get COVID vaccinations in the next year. Influenza vaccination policy is on the line. We also still do not have a final recommendation. We don't even know what's going to happen, at least I haven't heard, about the previous ACIP votes. RFK signed one of them, for a very narrow recommendation for a virus called chikungunya virus, but he did not sign off ACIP's recommendations on vaccinations for RSV and for meningococcus, which are very, very important diseases for which we now actually have, vaccines for. And so those are lying untouched. And we don't have a CDC director, as best I can tell. So we have RFK, who has made his name through really decades of undermining vaccine confidence, and now we have committee members on ACIP, who, by the way, I spoke to today. I'm not sure that I mentioned this, but I spoke to one of the 17 committee members who just lost their job as on that committee. They learned of this in the press. They learned of this by someone sending a text or an email of the Wall Street Journal editorial that RFK just published, in which he basically says that the CDC's vaccine committee is full of stooges with conflicts of interest. But he raises a couple of prior examples that are I'm not sure. I would have to go through these examples of whether what happened was the right policy choice or not. But he's saying that something is afoul in Denmark, but doesn't really give us enough to go on. I think I would better categorize his view as he has a sort of a fever dream that there is a conspiracy at this committee, because he misunderstands it, or and this would be generous, he misunderstands the difference between expertise and conflicts of interest, or that he just simply is weaponizing such a concept in order to make an excuse to vacate a body of experts. I mean, when you look down the list of the committee members of ACIP, there are basically two kinds of people on that list, okay? There are people I've never heard of, and then I look and see who they are, and they've got great resumes. And then there are people I have heard of, and I know that they are paragons of the field. They are respected scientists. They are measured individuals. They are people who care. They are people who just want their communities, our communities, to have access to preventative care. For an HHS that is claiming to care about preventative medicine, to undermine the vaccine system we have, is really a counterintuitive. We are learning more and more how many viruses contribute to chronic illness. And as an emergency doctor on the front line, I will tell you, how often do I see a patient with a chronic problem, or someone on the edge of having a chronic problem, like a heart failure, like emphysema, like kidney disease, for whom getting COVID or getting influenza or getting RSV or getting Epstein-Barr virus, another virus that really has been underappreciated in long-term diseases, these viruses can trigger it can either trigger a chronic disease or they can potentiate a chronic disease. So if you want to get chronic diseases under control, vaccines are a great way to do that, because it decreases the sort of hits, right? We can only, our body, I think of our bodies as just, we're punching bags and we just get hit and we get hit. Well, we don't want to have to take so many hits, and vaccines have really been helping us with that. And so to undermine that in this way goes against everything that I think they claim to be in favor of. And I will just also mention that unrelated to this, but related to the health of our communities and our kids, it's been a busy day. Earlier today, my colleagues and I published an article in JAMA Pediatrics, which is the leading pediatric journal by impact factor on the planet. And we were looking at firearm mortality in kids in the United States since the Supreme Court decision McDonald v. Chicago back in 2010. And, what we found is that the states with really loose laws have had a much, much bigger increase. They've actually had an increase in firearm mortality since 2010, to the extent that there are 7,400 excess firearm deaths in kids in the last 13 years. That's more than there would have been in just the states that really loosened their laws after that Supreme Court case. And in states like mine, Massachusetts, where things are quote unquote stricter, but we still, of course, have firearms, there has not been that increase. And so I mention this because RFK has been really pushing this idea of make America healthy again, make our kids healthy again. Well, when I read their reports, what's missing is a reference to the leading cause of death in American children over the age of 1. If you look at age 1 to 17 or 1 to 19, what is the leading cause of death in this country alone? It's firearms, I'm sorry to say. Now, people will poke holes in that. They'll say, "Oh, it's older kids." That's true. Firearms do not become the leading cause of death in our kids until the age of 13 or so, but before that, it's in the top 3 and the top 5, earlier in life. And if you want our kids to be healthy, they've got to be alive. And the best ways I know how to do that is things like car safety. I wrote about this in Inside Medicine today. You cannot leave the hospital with a newborn unless you have a car seat that has been shown to be safe, because motor vehicle collisions are a leading killer, used to be the leading killer of non-infant U.S. residents under 18, kids who are older than 1 year old. So we want to do something to help those kids. So we make sure that you can't leave the hospital with a newborn unless you have the right car seat. And we know that 50, 100 years ago, viruses were a major, major killer of kids. And they're not today because of vaccines. We know that. So we want to encourage that. But I don't see really that language in the Make America Healthy documentation from the past few weeks and months. And then we come to the study that I did looking at firearm mortality. And again, it's shocking that we would have firearms be a leading cause of death for young people in America, but have no mention of that in any discussion about keeping our kids healthy. Look, you can have red dye banned if you like, and see what difference that makes. I don't know what that will do, but I do know that the scale of it will be nothing like the scale of the effects of vaccine policies. Another example of this is you look at some states that have enacted vaccine exemptions for kids and then taken that back. That was smart, right? I mean, there are states that actually got rid of their philosophical exemptions for childhood vaccinations, so that the only reason a kid should be deprived of a vaccine is due to a medical exemption, which are quite rare, and not due to any philosophical reason. States that took those philosophical interventions away have had success. Straight up. Like that is what we need. So I really think that sometimes people say, "Oh, you've got to give RFK credit because he's getting this and that right." No, you don't. You don't have to give people credit. If I walk in and say, "Hey, I live on Earth and it's a globe and it's actually going around the sun. Oh, and by the way, unicorns are real." You don't have to give me credit for the first part of the sentence. Like I don't get it. Okay. So when people say you have to give them credit, I just say this: no, you don't. No, we don't. I give people credit when they get it right when it's tough, when it's difficult, and they get it wrong when it's not difficult. And I'm tired of that. And so I really feel like we need to stop seeding any ground on stuff that doesn't matter and focus on the stuff that does matter and fight these battles. Our votes matter. Our voices matter. Call your congresspeople. Call Cassidy's office. As a physician, I'm just angry with Dr. Cassidy, Senator Cassidy, that he got us into this mess. And I suspect, by the way, as I mentioned to Kate Legitolina, who was here earlier, I suspect that the Senator Cassidy is not thrilled right now with what's going on. The reason I suspect that is that after RFK was confirmed based on his vote, we have not seen a CDC director be confirmed. We had a CDC nominee who people were very worried had some anti-vaccine, anti-science views. And that nominee did not continue. That nominee was withdrawn. And I suspect that is because Senator Cassidy might have made it clear that he didn't want to make the same mistake twice. I don't know that, but that's just my suspicion is what happened. So that the nominee for CDC director was withdrawn. And so that tells me maybe Cassidy has grew that spine after he made the mistake on RFK. So now we have a situation in which we don't have we have a permanent nominee for CDC director. It is Susan Menares, who was the acting director at the CDC for a little while. And by law, Dr. Menares cannot be acting director whilst she is the nominee for the permanent position. And the CDC director position remains vacant, despite the fact that RFK said otherwise under oath to the Senate Health Committee. And I think that's bothersome. And I think that Senator Cassidy may be in a situation where he doesn't want to blink. And so he probably is someone that we can actually move. I think he's a heart and a mind that matters. And as pissed off as I am, as angry, as upset about the RFK vote as I am, I would say the best way for Dr. Cassidy, for Senator Cassidy to make that up to the American people is to stand up for science now, better late than never. It's very difficult to remove a secretary of a confirmed position. I don't think it's even legally all that possible. The advice and consent is of the Senate is given at the time of confirmation. It is not. It's not something that's up for continuous reassessments. I don't know if somebody can be impeached the way a president can, and it's possible. But if that were the case, again, it would take we know to remove a president, it is not just a majority of the House. You need 3/4 of the Senate. I don't know if the same rules apply to HHS secretaries or other cabinet members who have been Senate confirmed, but I can just tell you, for those asking what's the way out of this, the only way for RFK to leave his position as the head of HHS is for him to resign under pressure. I would just add that if I were Donald Trump, I would not be happy with RFK right now. Now, you may wonder why that is. And the reason I would say that is that you could say a lot about what the Trump administration did incorrectly or did correctly during the emergency phase of the COVID pandemic. And I could sit here and tell you some things that I would have done differently. But one thing the Trump administration did was to foster Operation Warp Speed. And Operation Warp Speed brought us safe and effective vaccines against COVID-19 in record time and saved millions and millions of lives. And that is an accomplishment that, Donald Trump did not make that vaccine, but his administration did foster an environment in which that was possible. And he should take credit for that. And so when RFK is out there saying that the mRNA vaccines are dangerous and he's making recommendations against the vaccines, including for immune naive infants, babies that have never seen the virus before, unlike the rest of us who have been vaccinated and infected probably, when he's out there doing that, he is undermining Trump's accomplishment on COVID vaccines. Trump could go down as someone who saved lives because of the COVID vaccines. And now his HHS secretary is out there saying that those vaccines are harmful in many cases. So I would be very upset if I were the president. I would say, hey, you can do what you want on some of these issues. You can go explore, but don't mess with my signature accomplishment from my first term, which is the COVID vaccines. So that's really what I would just sort of argue is the best way out of this, is for Trump to realize that to what extent his favorable legacy from anything he did during the pandemic can be said to exist. It's really wrapped up in the speed at which we got those vaccines to the public. And so Lena says Trump probably doesn't remember. Let's remind him. Let's say, hey, a lot of times people like me are out here saying negative things about what the administration is doing, and they expect us to hear they expect to hear bad things from us only. That's not the case. Let's give credit where credit is due and reinforce positivity. They did something good back in 2020. They made those vaccines happen in a phase 3 trial with tens of thousands of people. It was good. Let's give that credit. And if they forgot, let's remind them to say, hey, look, you can get a thumbs up from people who normally are opposing you on certain issues. So I wonder if that's a strategy, but as Gail here says, he's distanced himself from the COVID vaccine, and his base wants that. I fear that that's correct, but I think that maybe we can change that. Maybe we can say, hey, thanks for the COVID vaccines, President Trump. That was a really good thing, but no thanks for RFK for undermining them. So that's really where we're at. I'm going to have to wrap up in just a few minutes. Because it is late here. I've got to go up and have dinner with the fam. But I just want to just again reference the fact that this started with a great conversation with my friend Dr. Caitlin Gentilina of Your Local Epidemiologist. I'm Jeremy Faust of Inside Medicine. I'm an emergency doctor and a researcher in my spare time and a writer. And these kinds of videos, Caitlin and I, we often, prepare for our public appearances and we think about everything very carefully, but we wanted to just kind of go into this kind of just right away with this news cycle and just get to you and explain why we're concerned about RFK vacating the CDC's immunization expert body, the ACIP. And we really need to raise that alarm, to sound that alarm, to say, no, it's not okay. We want to be in a safe environment for ourselves, for our kids, for our at-risk loved ones. And we want transparency. And we don't need every single vaccine, right? And there's a really good conversation to have about the dosing strategy. How often do we need it? Some people are going to need some things more than others. That is what this committee has been doing very well. I'm concerned that we're heading towards taking that public buy-in from the experts and from the public process, and we are replacing that with the opinion of a select anointed few who think they've got it all figured out. That wouldn't be how I would do it. I would trust that we have experts who can have an adult conversation about these things. So this conversation will be shared on Inside Medicine. You can subscribe for free. It will likely also, I can't speak for Caitlin Gentilina, it'll probably also show up on Your Local Epidemiologist, which is Caitlin's amazing Substack as well. We both do a lot of work where this is all free. That being said, you can always upgrade to pay to support this work. This is how we are able to do it. So if you subscribe, do me a favor, hit the like button, hit the share button. Those are the big ones. But if you can support Your Local Epidemiologist and Inside Medicine with a paid upgrade, that is what makes it so we can do this work. So I also want to just thank you all. There are right now there are 4,500 people watching this, and many more will watch this later. That's a lot of people to carry just on no notice on a live app in the middle of the afternoon on a Monday. So the fact that you are here to listen to this, to help us think through these issues and to share this content is extremely meaningful. It is the only hope we have. So I want to thank you all for doing this, for joining me and for sharing this. And we will continue this conversation. And until then, have a great evening and keep on fighting.